Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Look, here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy still hasn't quite figured out. They have this absolutely unhinged tendency to look at apex predators. Things with more teeth than sense, claws that could peel open a battle cruiser, and appetites that would make a black hole jealous, and think, yeah, I could pet that. So when Hannah walked into the arrival terminal of Nexus Station with two shrill cubs perched on her shoulders, like the universe's most dangerous fashion accessories, the collective reaction was, well, let's just say panic doesn't quite cover it. Nexus Station, for those blissfully unaware, is one of those massive diplomatic hubs where 100 different species pretend to get along while secretly plotting trade advantages and trying not to start interstellar incidents. It's got gleaming corridors wide enough to fit a small spacecraft, market districts where you can buy anything from Antarian silk to weaponized spore colonies, and enough bureaucracy to choke a supernova. The place runs on three things: commerce, politics, and an unspoken agreement that everyone checks their planet-destroying weaponry at the door. Hannah strolled through the biometric scanners like she was taking an evening walk, her boots clicking against polished metal floors that reflected the swirling nebula visible through the transparent aluminum ceiling. She was dressed practically, cargo pants with about 30 pockets, a jacket that had seen better decades, and a shirt that read, "I rescue wildlife and I vote," in 3 languages, only one of which was human. Her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that had given up on perfection sometime last week, and her expression suggested she had exactly 0 patience for nonsense. The cubs, meanwhile, were living their best lives. Whisper, the slightly smaller of the two, had his massive head resting on top of Hannah's, his crystalline fangs, each one about the length of a human finger and glowing faintly with bioluminescence, jutting out in a way that should have been terrifying, but somehow came across as drowsy. His 6 limbs were arranged around Hannah's torso like some kind of organic climbing harness, his muscular body covered in scales that shifted between deep blue and silver depending on how the light hit them. Howl, the larger cub, had claimed Hannah's left shoulder as his personal throne, his tail, thick as a ship's cable and tipped with what could only be described as nature's answer to a morning star, wrapped loosely around her waist for balance. His eyes, which were split pupils surrounded by rings of amber and violet, tracked every movement in the terminal with the lazy interest of something that knew it was at the top of the food chain and didn't need to prove it. The scanner array went absolutely berserk. Warning lights flooded the terminal in angry red, alarms shrieked like someone was murdering a synthesizer, and automated defense turrets deployed from the ceiling with the kind of mechanical enthusiasm that suggested they'd been waiting months for something exciting to happen. Weapons-grade biological entities detected, the station's AI announced in that special tone of artificial panic that programmers apparently think is helpful. Security response initiated. All personnel evacuate to safe zones. Hannah stopped walking, sighed the kind of sigh that carries the weight of having dealt with this exact situation at least a dozen times before, and waited. The other beings in the terminal did not wait. They scattered like someone had just announced free oxygen was no longer a thing. A family of Versians, those bird-like creatures who always look vaguely offended by everything, took flight in a flurry of indignant squawking and molting feathers. A group of methane breathers in their environmental suits bumped into each other in their haste to reach the exits, creating a domino effect that would have been hilarious if everyone wasn't convinced they were about to be eaten. One enterprising merchant abandoned an entire cart of what looked like space fruits, which promptly rolled across the floor and added a slapstick element to the chaos. A three-eyed Dullian child, however, had stopped mid-evacuation and was staring at the cubs with the kind of wonder only children seem capable of. "Pretty," the kid whispered, before their parent scooped them up and ran like their tail was on fire. Whisper yawned, a long, leisurely stretch of his jaws that revealed rows of crystalline teeth that could probably bite through the station's hull plating if he put his mind to it. The yawn was accompanied by a sound somewhere between a purr and distant thunder. Security arrived in force about 30 seconds later, which, credit where it's due, was actually pretty impressive response time. The team was led by Officer Bansel, a Chithrax who looked like someone had taken a praying mantis, scaled it up to about 8 feet tall, given it body armor, and then decided that wasn't intimidating enough and added 6 more eyes. He moved with the precise, jerky motions of his species, his compound eyes all focused on Hannah, with the kind of intensity that suggested he took his job very, very seriously. Behind him came a squad of mixed-species security personnel, all armed with neural disruptors, containment fields, and what appeared to be either great courage or a shocking lack of self-preservation instinct. "You," Bansel said, his voice buzzing through a translator that gave his words a metallic edge. "Will explain why you have brought unauthorized predator species onto this station. Now." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Just one. It was a talent." "They're authorized. I have all the permits." "Scanners indicate those are Shral juveniles." Bansel's mandibles clicked together in what might have been agitation. "Shral are classified as Class A existential threats. They are banned on all civilian stations under Galactic Convention Statute 429. Statute 429 has an exception clause for licensed handlers transporting bonded animals under diplomatic protection," Hannah replied, her tone suggesting she'd memorized the entire legal code just to win arguments exactly like this one. "Which I am, and which they are. Would you like to see my credentials? Or are we going to stand here until Whisper gets hungry and decides your leg looks like a snack?" Whisper, right on cue, made a soft, chirping sound and nuzzled against Hannah's cheek. It would have been adorable if he wasn't a baby apex predator whose adult form could hunt starships for sport. Several security officers took involuntary steps backward. Bansel didn't move, but his mandibles clicked more rapidly. "Your credentials are irrelevant. Station security has the authority to detain any entity deemed a threat to civilian safety." "Are they threatening anyone?" Hannah asked, scratching Howl behind what passed for ears on a Shral, these ridged sections along his skull that apparently contained his auditory organs. Howl leaned into the scratch, his eyes half closing in bliss, and began to purr. The sound resonated through the terminal like someone had parked a running hoverbike too close to the speakers. "They are inherently threatening by their very nature," Bansel insisted. Hannah's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but definitely qualified as dangerous. "So am I, officer. So are you. So is literally everyone with teeth and the ability to make poor choices. These two are cubs. They're well-fed, well-trained, and they've never hurt anyone who didn't try to hurt them first." She paused, letting that last part sink in. "The question isn't whether they're dangerous. The question is whether you're going to make them feel like they need to defend themselves." The security team exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that happens when everyone suddenly realizes they might have made a tactical error. Bansel, however, was either braver or more stubborn than his subordinates. "You will accompany us to holding while we verify your documentation. The creatures will be placed in containment." "No," Hannah said simply. That was not a request. And that was not a negotiation. Hannah's voice went flat. The kind of flat that suggests a line has been crossed, and things are about to get interesting in the worst possible way. Whisper and Howl stay with me. They go where I go. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with Ambassador Scholan of the Shral Territorial Council, who is expecting me and will be extremely interested to hear that station security is interfering with protected diplomatic guests. That made Bansel pause. Even through his compound eyes and alien facial structure, you could see the mental calculation happening. Pissing off a human with a couple of predator cubs was one thing. Pissing off a Shral ambassador was the kind of mistake that ended careers, and possibly lives. "Fine," he said, his translator giving the word a harsh edge. "You will all come with us for processing. But the creatures remain in your custody at your own risk." "They always are," Hannah said, and smiled the kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly how much risk that entailed, and had made peace with it long ago. As the security team formed up around her, keeping a very respectful distance, Hannah caught sight of a reflective panel showing her own image. One human woman, completely calm, with two alien predator cubs draped over her shoulders like the universe's most dangerous stole, walking into what was probably going to be several hours of bureaucratic tedium. Howl yawned again, showing off his teeth. Whisper's tail flicked lazily, and Hannah walked forward into whatever came next, because that's what humans do. They look at impossible situations, shrug, and keep walking. Somewhere in the terminal, someone was probably updating a betting pool on whether this would end in paperwork or bloodshed. Smart money, honestly, was on both. The holding area, as it turned out, was less secure interrogation room and more fancy waiting lounge where we pretend you're not technically under arrest. It had soft lighting, chairs designed for about a dozen different body configurations, a refreshment station that promised beverages from 30-star systems, and absolutely no windows. The lack of windows was probably intentional. Can't have detainees knowing exactly where on the station they were being held after all. Hannah sat in one of the human-compatible chairs, which still wasn't quite right because, apparently, nobody had bothered to update the furniture specifications since first contact, and watched as Whisper and Howl explored their new environment with the focused intensity of predators evaluating potential hunting grounds. Whisper had discovered that the recycled air vents made interesting sounds when you stuck your face into them. Howl had decided that the refreshment station was clearly designed as a climbing structure and had scaled it with the grace of something that evolution had spent millions of years optimizing for vertical surfaces. "Get down from there," Hannah said, without looking up from her datapad. Howl chirped at her, a sound that roughly translated to, "But I'm comfortable." "Down. Now." The cub grumbled. Actually grumbled. A noise that sounded like rocks tumbling down a mountainside, and descended with exaggerated slowness, making sure Hannah knew he was only complying under protest. The door hissed open, with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested someone had been waiting outside for maximum effect, and in walked what could only be described as bureaucratic authority, given physical form. Station Administrator Nalmish was a Verzian, which meant he looked like someone had taken a bird of paradise, made it sapient, given it opposable wing claws, and then dressed it in formal robes that cost more than a small spacecraft. His plumage was an ostentatious display of iridescent blues and greens. His beak was sharp enough to be registered as a weapon in some systems, and his eyes, those predatory bird eyes that could spot movement from absurd distances, were currently fixed on Hannah with the kind of disdain usually reserved for finding something unpleasant on your shoe. Behind him came Bansel and two more security personnel, all of whom looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. "Hannah," Nalmish said, his voice carrying that particular aristocratic tone that suggested he'd learned to speak by listening to people who'd learned to speak by reading ancient texts about proper elocution. He held up a datapad. "Hannah of Earth. No family designation, no regional identifier, just Hannah." "That's me," Hannah agreed pleasantly. "Nice to meet you, too." Nalmish's beak clicked in annoyance. "Your file makes for quite interesting reading. In the past 8 months alone, you have been involved in incidents on 6 stations, 3 planetary surfaces, and 1 diplomatic vessel. Incidents involving, let me see here, unauthorized wildlife rescue, violation of quarantine protocols, destruction of private property. That property was being used to cage sentient beings illegally," Hannah interrupted. "Assault on corporate security personnel. They shot first. And grand theft of a transport vessel. I prefer to call it aggressive borrowing for humanitarian purposes," Hannah said, leaning back in her chair. Whisper had abandoned the air vent and was now climbing into her lap, which would have been cute if he didn't weigh about as much as a medium-sized human and have claws that could shred composite armor. "Also, I gave it back, mostly intact." Nalmish's feathers ruffled. "You are a menace to orderly society." "I'm a menace to people who hurt animals," Hannah corrected. "There's a difference. Which brings us to these." Nalmish gestured at Whisper and Howl, the latter of whom was now attempting to groom himself, and doing that thing cats do where they somehow end up in positions that should violate several laws of physics. "Shral cubs, do you have any comprehension of what you have brought onto my station?" "2 babies who need protection and care," Hannah said flatly. "2 specimens of the most efficient predator species known to galactic science," Nalmish countered. "Adult Shral have been documented hunting in the void of space, using debris fields as ambush points to take down transport ships. Their jaw strength can crush starship-grade alloys. Their pack coordination is more sophisticated than most military tactical networks. They are, by every measurable standard, walking nightmares wrapped in scales and teeth." "And these 2 are cubs," Hannah repeated, scratching Whisper under his chin. The cub's eyes closed in bliss, and he began to purr again, a sound that made the walls vibrate gently. "They're 8 months old. In Shral terms, that's basically toddlers. Toddlers that could disembowel a grown version without breaking a sweat," Nalmish said. "Don't have sweat glands, actually," Hannah replied. "Shral regulate temperature through their scales. It's quite fascinating, really. They can survive in environments ranging from near absolute zero to temperatures that would melt most metals. The scales—" "I did not ask for a biology lesson," Nalmish snapped. Hannah shrugged. "You brought it up." Bansel stepped forward, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "Administrator, if I may, the issue is not what these creatures are, but what they represent. Shral do not bond with other species. They do not show affection. They certainly do not allow themselves to be transported across the galaxy like common pets. What this human has done is unprecedented and concerning." "Oh, I'm so glad you think it's concerning," Hannah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm that could probably etch steel. "Because you know what I find concerning? The fact that Whisper and Howl's mother was killed by poachers 3 months ago? Shot while she was hunting to feed her cubs? Do you know what they were going to do with her body? Harvest her scales and fangs for the luxury market? Sell them to rich collectors who wanted trophies? And the cubs? They were going to sell them to illegal fighting rings." The room went very quiet. Hannah's voice, when she continued, had lost all trace of humor. I found them starving in a cargo hold, locked in a cage barely big enough for one of them, let alone both. They were dehydrated, terrified, and about 3 days from dying. So I broke into that ship, I took them, and I spent the next month teaching them to trust again. Teaching them that not every sentient being wants to hurt them. Whisper, as if sensing the shift in Hannah's emotional state, pressed his massive head against her chest and made a soft, questioning sound. "And you did this out of compassion?" Nalmish asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he genuinely didn't understand the concept. "I did it because someone had to," Hannah said. "Because the alternative was letting 2 innocent beings die alone and scared. Because I'm a xenobiologist who specializes in predator rehabilitation, and I had the skills to help them. Pick whichever reason makes sense to you." "And now you have brought them here," Bansel said, "to Nexus Station. Why?" Hannah took a breath, her expression hardening. "Because tomorrow I testify in the trial against the Obsidian Syndicate, the trafficking ring that's been hunting endangered species across 6 sectors. The same ring that killed Whisper and Howl's mother. The same ring that's been operating with impunity because they have friends in high places." Nalmish's feathers went flat against his body, which in Verzian body language meant something between surprise and alarm. "The Obsidian Syndicate trial is classified information. How did you?" "Because I'm the one who provided half the evidence," Hannah said. "I've been tracking them for 2 years. Every rescue I've done, every incident on my record, was me following the trail of their operations. And tomorrow, I'm going to stand in that courtroom and make sure everyone knows exactly what they've been doing." "You're insane," Nalmish said flatly. "The Syndicate has connections throughout this station. Security, administration, even judicial oversight. The moment you walk into that courtroom, you become a target." "Hence the cubs," Hannah said, gesturing to Whisper and Howl. "They're not just companions. They're witnesses. They're proof. And they're protection." "They're children," Bansel said, and there was something almost sympathetic in his buzzing voice. "You would put children in danger?" Hannah's smile was sharp enough to cut. "Officer, with all due respect, these cubs have survived poachers, starvation, and a 3-month journey across hostile space. They're Shral. Danger is their natural habitat. The question isn't whether I'm putting them at risk. The question is whether the Syndicate is stupid enough to try something with them around." Howl chose that moment to yawn, showing off his impressive collection of crystalline fangs. Nalmish looked at the cubs, then at Hannah, then at Bansel. "This is highly irregular." "Welcome to my life," Hannah said. "You understand that station security cannot guarantee your safety if you insist on pursuing this course of action?" "I've never asked for guarantees," Hannah replied. "Just stay out of my way." Nalmish muttered something in his native language that the translator wisely chose not to interpret, and turned toward the door. "You're cleared for temporary station access. Your quarters are in Section H, Level 9. Security will escort you. Do try not to cause an interstellar incident before tomorrow." "No promises," Hannah said cheerfully. As the version administrator swept out of the room in a flutter of expensive robes and ruffled dignity, Bansel lingered for a moment. His compound eyes studied Hannah with an intensity that suggested he was trying to solve a particularly complex equation. "You really believe those cubs see you as pack?" he asked quietly. "I know they do," Hannah said. "Just like I know they're smarter than half the beings who've underestimated them." Bansel's mandibles clicked once, slowly. Then he turned and followed his administrator out. Hannah looked down at Whisper and Howl, both of whom were now watching her with those unsettling split-pupil eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Well," she said, "that went better than expected. Nobody got bitten, nothing got broken, and we're not in an actual cell. I'm calling that a win." Whisper chirped agreement. Howl yawned again. And somewhere in the administrative offices of Nexus Station, in systems Hannah didn't have access to, someone was already making plans to ensure she never made it to that courtroom. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Hannah had cubs to feed and a testimony to prepare. One crisis at a time. The quarters they'd assigned Hannah were actually pretty decent, which immediately made her suspicious. When you spend enough time being shuffled around various stations and facilities, you develop a sixth sense for when things are too good to be true. This room had actual space, a bed that looked human-compatible, a viewing port showing the nebula outside, and a door that locked from the inside. The last part was what really caught her attention, because secure quarters didn't usually give the detainee control over their own locks. Either station security was being unusually generous, or someone wanted to make it very easy to trap her inside. Hannah dropped her travel pack on the floor and watched as Whisper and Howl immediately began their security sweep of the room, which mostly consisted of sniffing every corner, testing every surface with their claws, and making absolutely certain that no threats lurked behind the refresher unit or under the furniture. "What do you two think?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. Howl paused mid-sniff and made a low rumbling sound that Hannah had learned to interpret as "something's off." Whisper joined in with a higher-pitched trill that roughly meant agreement with his brother's assessment. "Yeah, that's what I thought too," Hannah muttered. She pulled out her datapad and ran a basic sweep for surveillance devices, which came up clean. But that didn't mean much. Good surveillance tech wouldn't be caught by basic sweeps. She was in the middle of checking the ventilation system, because if someone wanted in, that's where they'd come from, when the door chimed. Hannah froze. Whisper and Howl immediately flanked her, their bodies going tense in that way that meant they'd shifted from curious cubs to active threat assessment in about half a second. "Who is it?" Hannah called out. "Someone who would very much like not to be eaten," came a voice from the other side, and it was a voice Hannah hadn't expected. Deep, resonant, with a rumbling quality that suggested a very large chest cavity, and speaking in the kind of galactic common that came from someone who'd learned it as a third or fourth language. Hannah moved to the door panel, checked the external camera feed, and felt her eyebrows climb toward her hairline. Standing in the corridor, filling most of the available space, was a Shral adult. And not just any Shral. This one was massive, easily 12 feet at the shoulder, with scales that shifted between deep crimson and gold. Her 6 limbs were thick with muscle, each one tipped with claws that could probably tear through the station's hull if she felt motivated. Her crystalline fangs, instead of the faint glow that Whisper and Howl had, blazed with steady bioluminescence that made her look like she'd been forged in a star. A complex harness of what looked like diplomatic regalia was draped across her upper body, marked with symbols that Hannah vaguely recognized as territorial designations. This was someone important. Hannah opened the door. "Ambassador Scholan, I presume?" she said, because there was really only one Shral ambassador to the Galactic Council, and if there was a second one, someone had really dropped the ball on Hannah's briefing materials. The massive predator inclined her head, a gesture that was somehow both regal and friendly. "And you are Hannah, who my sources tell me has accomplished something that should not be possible." Whisper and Howl, who had been coiled like springs ready to launch, suddenly relaxed. They made identical chirping sounds and bounded forward, which would have been adorable if they weren't each the size of a small hover car. Scholan lowered herself to their level, and the cubs approached with their heads down, their tails still. Body language that Hannah had learned meant deep respect in Shral culture. The ambassador touched her snout to each cub in turn, making soft rumbling sounds that Hannah's translator couldn't quite parse. Then Scholan did something that made Hannah's brain temporarily short-circuit. The massive Shral turned and bowed. Not a little head nod, but a full, formal bow that involved lowering her entire front section until her head was level with her forelimbs. "Ah," Hannah said, which was not her most eloquent moment, but honestly could be forgiven under the circumstances. "What are you doing?" "Showing respect," Scholan said, rising back to her full height, which was still impressive enough to make Hannah feel like a particularly small snack. "You have been chosen by Pack. You are hunt-born. This is sacred." "I'm sorry. I'm what now?" Scholan's eyes, split pupils surrounded by rings of amber, just like the cubs but infinitely more intense, focused on Hannah with the kind of attention that prey animals probably experienced right before becoming lunch. Shral choose Pack at birth. We bond with siblings, with parents, with those we hunt beside. We do not bond with other species. We do not extend Pack trust to beings outside our own kind. It has never happened in recorded history. "Until now," Hannah said slowly, pieces clicking together. "Until you," Scholan confirmed. "Whisper and Howl have claimed you as Pack. Not as master, not as keeper, but as equal, as huntmate, as family. They would die for you, Hannah, and they trust that you would do the same for them." Hannah looked down at the two cubs, who had returned to her side and were now leaning against her legs with enough weight to make standing interesting. "Well, yeah, obviously." "Obviously," Scholan repeated, and there was something in her tone that might have been amusement. "You say this as if it is simple, as if it is natural. But what you have done is reshape what my people believed possible. You have proven that Pack bond can transcend species. There is no precedent, no framework. You have become something new." "I just raised 2 orphaned cubs," Hannah protested. "I fed them, kept them safe, taught them to trust. That's not revolutionary. That's just basic decency." "That," Scholan said, "is why it worked. You did not try to dominate them. You did not try to tame them. You simply existed alongside them as partner, not master. And they recognized this." Hannah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then something occurred to her. "You're here because of the trial tomorrow." "I am here because of what the trial represents," Scholan corrected. "The Obsidian Syndicate has hunted my people for decades. They have killed Pack leaders, stolen cubs, harvested our bodies for profit. And they have done this with impunity, because they corrupted systems that should have protected us. Your testimony tomorrow could finally bring them to justice." "Could," Hannah noted, "not will." Scholan's rumble carried a note of grim understanding. "The Syndicate has many arms, many allies. I have been investigating security compromises on this station for months. Someone here is feeding them information. Someone here will attempt to stop you from reaching that courtroom." "Let them try," Hannah said, and her voice carried the kind of cold certainty that suggested she'd been in worse situations and survived. "I believe they will," Scholan said, "which is why I wanted to meet you, to understand who had claimed my people's cubs as Pack. to see if you were worthy of that bond. Hannah met the ambassador's gaze steadily. And what's your assessment? Scholan's fangs showed in what might have been a smile. That any being foolish enough to threaten you will learn why Shral cubs are not helpless, even when young, and why the human who they have chosen as pack is perhaps more dangerous than they appear. I'm not dangerous, Hannah said. I'm just really, really persistent. In my experience, Scholan said, those are the same thing. The ambassador moved toward the door, her massive form somehow managing to be graceful despite her size. She paused at the threshold and looked back. Hannah, the cubs you have raised, when they are grown, they will be among the finest hunters of their generation, and they will remember that a human taught them to trust again. That is no small gift. They're the ones who gave me a gift, Hannah said quietly. They trusted me when they had every reason not to. That's worth more than any diplomatic recognition. Scholan inclined her head once more, then departed, her footsteps echoing down the corridor with the heavy tread of something that had never needed to hide its presence. Hannah closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The past 3 months had been a continuous sprint of survival, investigation, and keeping 2 growing predator cubs fed and safe. Tomorrow would be the culmination of all that work, assuming she lived long enough to testify. Whisper nudged her hand with his snout, and Howl made a questioning trill. I'm okay, Hannah told them, just thinking about tomorrow, about what happens if we actually pull this off. Both cubs chirped, a sound that meant comfort and reassurance. Yeah, you're right, Hannah said, moving toward the bed. One crisis at a time. For now, we sleep. Tomorrow, we change the galaxy. She lay down, and the cubs arranged themselves around her. Whisper at her feet, Howl against her side, both of them warm and solid and real. Their breathing steadied into the rhythm of sleep. That particular pattern that Hannah had learned meant they felt safe. Hannah closed her eyes and tried to rest, but her instincts, the same ones that had kept her alive this long, kept screaming that something was wrong. She was right, of course. In the maintenance tunnels beneath her quarters, someone was already cutting through security barriers. In the station's central hub, Bansel was receiving encrypted messages that made his compound eyes gleam with anticipation. And in a docking bay on the far side of the station, mercenaries were checking their weapons and preparing for a job they'd been promised would be simple. None of them understood what they were about to walk into. None of them had ever faced a human who had decided that enough was enough. And absolutely none of them had ever fought Shral cubs who understood that their pack was being threatened. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. Tonight, though, Hannah slept with her hand resting on Whisper's scales and dreamed of justice that had teeth. Hannah woke to the sound of something that didn't belong. Not the hum of the station's life support, not the distant rumble of ships docking, not even the soft breathing of 2 predator cubs who had somehow managed to take up an entire bed, despite starting the night in reasonable positions. No, this was the whisper-quiet hiss of a door seal being bypassed, the kind of sound that most people would sleep right through. Hannah was not most people. Her eyes snapped open, her hand already reaching for the neural disruptor she'd tucked under her pillow, and she caught Whisper's gaze in the dim light. The cub was already awake, already alert, his body coiled with the kind of tension that meant he'd heard it too. Howl was at the door, silent as death, his split pupil eyes reflecting what little light filtered through the viewport. Someone was coming in. Hannah rolled off the bed without making a sound, her bare feet touching the cold floor as she moved into position. The cubs knew their role without needing commands. They'd practiced this exact scenario a dozen times during their months together. because Hannah believed in being prepared for the worst. The door slid open with barely a whisper, and three figures in tactical gear moved through with the practiced efficiency of professionals. They had weapons, scanning equipment, and the kind of body language that said they'd done this before, and expected it to go smoothly. Their first mistake was thinking Hannah would still be in bed. Their second mistake was not accounting for Schral cubs having significantly better low-light vision than most species. Their third and final mistake was assuming this would be easy. Hannah hit the first one with a neural blast that dropped him before he could shout a warning. Whisper went low, sweeping the second attacker's legs with his tail. All that coiled muscle and crystalline ridges hitting like a battering ram. The merc went down hard, and before he could recover, the cub was on him, fangs at his throat, making it very clear that movement would be unwise. The third attacker got a shot off, a plasma bolt that scorched the wall where Hannah had been standing half a second earlier. She dove, rolled, came up behind him, and introduced her elbow to his spine with enough force to make him reconsider his career choices. Howl, not wanting to be left out, pounced on the first attacker Hannah had dropped and sat on him, which was both effective containment and probably uncomfortable, given that the cub weighed about 200 pounds of muscle and attitude. The entire fight had taken maybe 10 seconds. Hannah stood in the center of her quarters, breathing hard, neural disruptor aimed at the three groaning mercenaries, and felt her anger shift from hot to ice cold. "So," she said conversationally, "who sent you? And please don't insult my intelligence by claiming this was a random mugging." The one under Whisper's fangs made a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at defiance, but came out more like terrified whimpering. "That's what I thought," Hannah said. She moved to her pack, pulled out restraint cuffs, because of course she carried restraint cuffs, and secured all three attackers while the cubs kept them thoroughly intimidated. Then she activated her comm unit. "Station security. This is Hannah in quarters H9. I've got 3 armed intruders who tried to kill me. You might want to send someone to collect them." There was a pause, then Bansel's voice came through, sounding oddly uncertain. "Hannah, remain where you are. Security is en route." "Oh, I'm not going anywhere," Hannah said sweetly. "In fact, I think we should have a nice long conversation about station security protocols and how 3 armed mercenaries got past all your checkpoints. I'm sure it'll be fascinating." She cut the comm before Bansel could respond, then looked at the cubs. "Good work, both of you. But this was just the opening move. They'll try something bigger." Whisper chirped agreement and went back to intimidating his prisoner, who had apparently decided that playing dead was the best survival strategy. Hannah was proven right about 20 minutes later when her entire quarters shook with a concussive blast that came from somewhere in the station's infrastructure. Alarms began shrieking, emergency lighting kicked in, and her comm unit exploded with panicked chatter about hull breaches, evacuations, and catastrophic system failures in Section H. "Of course," Hannah muttered, "can't assassinate one human quietly, so let's just blow up half the station." Very subtle. She grabbed her pack, made sure the evidence chips were still secure in their hidden compartment, and looked at the cubs. "Time to move, boys. Someone just escalated from murder to terrorism, and I'm guessing they're going to use the chaos to finish the job." The station was pandemonium. Beings of a dozen species were flooding the corridors, some heading for escape pods, others trying to reach safe zones, all of them panicking with the special kind of terror that comes from realizing your safe haven has just become a death trap. Hannah pushed through the crowd, the cubs clearing a path simply by existing. Nothing makes people move quite like 2 Schral predators moving with purpose. She was 3 corridors away from the secure data vault, where she'd stored backup copies of her testimony when she ran into Bansel. The Chithrax was standing in the middle of an intersection, blocking her path, and his body language had shifted from professional security officer to something considerably more hostile. Behind him stood a squad of armed personnel, and none of them were wearing official station security uniforms. "Hannah," Bansel said, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction. "How convenient. I was just coming to find you." "Let me guess," Hannah said, her voice flat. "You're going to tell me that the explosion was an unfortunate accident, and I need to come with you for my own protection, and everything will be fine if I just cooperate." "Something like that, yes. And I'm guessing the Obsidian Syndicate is paying you enough to risk an interstellar warrant for terrorism and murder." Bansel's compound eyes gleamed. "They pay me enough not to care. Now, you can come quietly, or my associates here can make this unpleasant. Your choice." Hannah looked at the mercenaries, counted weapons, assessed angles, and came to a conclusion. "Here's my counteroffer. You step aside. I get to the vault. I transmit my testimony to the tribunal, and then you can spend the rest of your life in a very small cell thinking about your choices. How's that sound?" "That sounds," Bansel said, "like you don't understand your situation. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options." Hannah smiled, and it was not a nice smile. "You made 2 mistakes, Bansel. First, you threatened innocence by blowing up part of the station. Second, you assumed these 2 answer only to me." She looked down at Whisper and Howl, who had gone absolutely still, in that way predators do right before they strike. "Boys, he's threatening our pack. All of it. Every being on this station is part of what we protect. You know what to do." What happened next was something that would become station legend, the kind of story people told in hushed voices when they wanted to explain why you never, ever cornered a human with shrill cubs. The cubs moved like liquid violence, like physics had taken a coffee break, and decided that things like momentum and reasonable force were optional. Whisper went high, Howl went low, and both of them struck with the coordinated precision of beings who had been hunting together since birth. Mercenaries scattered, weapons fired wild, and somewhere in the chaos, Bansel realized he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Hannah didn't wait to watch. She ran, letting the cubs handle the threat while she focused on the mission. The vault was close, just 2 more corridors, and she could already see the reinforced doors that would give her access to the station's secure transmission array. She made it to the entrance, slapped her credentials against the scanner, and waited the 3 agonizing seconds it took for the system to verify her identity. The doors opened, she dove through, and immediately sealed them behind her. The vault was quiet, sterile, filled with data cores and transmission equipment. Hannah moved to the primary console, plugged in her evidence chips, and started the upload sequence. The tribunal chambers were 3 star systems away, but quantum-entangled communication meant they'd receive everything in real time. Names, transactions, routes, witnesses, every piece of evidence she'd gathered over 2 years, documenting the syndicate's operations across 6 sectors. Everything they'd done, everyone they'd bribed, every atrocity they'd committed. The upload bar crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Outside the vault, she could hear weapons fire, the sound of cubs who had gone from playful to deadly, and Bansel shouting orders that nobody seemed interested in following anymore. 50% uploaded. The vault doors shook as something impacted them from outside. 75%. Ambassador Scholan's voice came through Hannah's comm. "Hannah, I am en route to your position with actual loyal security forces. Hold your ground. Planning on it, Hannah said. 90%. The doors buckled inward. 100%. Upload complete. Transmission confirmed. Hannah leaned back from the console and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Got you, you bastards! Evidence is delivered. Tribunal has everything, and there's not a single thing you can do to stop it now. The vault doors finally gave way, and Bansel stumbled through, his armor scorched, his mandibles clicking erratically. Behind him came Whisper and Howl, both looking incredibly pleased with themselves. You, Bansel said, pointing at Hannah with a weapon that shook in his grip. You have destroyed everything. No, Hannah said calmly. I just made sure justice actually happens. There's a difference. Scholan arrived moments later with 24 security personnel, all of them loyal, all of them looking at Bansel with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something you'd scrape off, your boot. The Chithrax was arrested. His co-conspirators were rounded up, and slowly, carefully, order was restored to the station. 3 days later, Hannah stood in the observation deck, watching ships come and go, while Whisper and Howl napped in a sunbeam that streamed through the viewport. The tribunal had handed down sentences. The syndicate was broken. And somehow, against all odds, they'd actually won. Nalmish approached, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Hannah, on behalf of station administration, we apologize. For everything. Apology accepted, Hannah said. Try to hire better security next time. Yes, well. The version shuffled his wing claws awkwardly. You're being granted permanent access to Nexus Station, diplomatic immunity, and the Council has asked if you'd be interested in a position as an official liaison between humans and the Shral territories. Hannah looked down at the cubs, who were drooling on the expensive station carpeting. I'll think about it. Right now, I've got 2 growing predators who need proper hunting training, and that means finding somewhere with actual prey animals and open sky. She paused, then smiled. But I'll be back. Someone's got to make sure you people don't screw up again. As Hannah walked toward the docking bay, cubs at her side, someone from the crowd called out, Excuse me, are those dangerous? Hannah didn't break stride. Only if you are. And somewhere in the galaxy, someone else was probably making the same mistake, underestimating what a human could accomplish when they decided something needed to be done. They'd learn. They always did. Eventually.